beautiful.
Hello, lovers of the world. This is Sinta speaking. I really love murder mystery novels, but they aren't necessarily the most imaginative when it comes to book titles. And then one day I realized that five of the most recent books I read started with either murder at or murder in. So I decided to take those five and put them into one big bulk review video. This is not a spoiler free video, by the way. I want to freely discuss anything and everything that I liked and disliked about the book. I will add chapters to the video so you can skip to the ones that you have read or skip over the ones that you haven't yet. So while I do love murder mysteries, I typically tend to just reading people that I know I will already like. And so this time I tried to venture into different subgenres of the murder mystery genre. This is the first time I'm venturing into books with a more specific focus on romance. And I want you to keep that in mind while I'm venting about these books because it will be obvious that I am biased on certain things that may or may not be just parts of the genre, and I don't want to yuck anyone's yum. And I fully acknowledge that anything that I dislike about the book may be something that a different reader will find to be a great aspect of the book. First, I'll talk about Murder at Morlington Hall by Clara McKenna. So this was just something that I found on Goodreads, and so I thought I'd give it a try. This is the first book of the Stella and Lindy series, where Stella is an American heiress that moves to England following her engagement to Lindy, who is the only son of a British aristocratic family that needs money. So I thought this was a really interesting premise because it's a chance to kind of explore the culture clash between the American elite and the English elite in terms of navigating polite society in this specific time period, as well as examining perhaps some very interesting historical class shifts as the nouveau riche begin to rub elbows with old money. So I thought that could be some really interesting commentary on class, on the wealthy, and all these economic shifts happening in that time period. So I was quite excited. So this is the first time, again, I've read a more romance-oriented novel. And in that case, this might be a trope in the genre that I'm just not used to yet. But I really dislike our female protagonist, Stella Kendrick, and I don't like how she's written. She's bland, in my opinion, and doesn't have a flaw that I find to be interesting to her character. And I just think that makes her boring to read. She's supposed to be outspoken and confident, which is why she kind of gets into these conflicts with the people that she's surrounded with. But in the text, she doesn't really defend herself when someone makes a passive aggressive comment about her and her family, or whenever someone tries to criticize her, she doesn't try to stand up for herself, and it doesn't say in the text why. I actually prefer Lindy, our male protagonist, a little bit more because at least he's given a good balance of good qualities and bad qualities. He's definitely haughty and arrogant and self-centered, but he's still kind in his own way, kind in a way that makes sense for his character. He's definitely spoiled, but you can tell he has a good heart, and he'll continue to grow as a person as the series goes on. Meanwhile, Stella doesn't really have any flaws that is highlighted as something that she needs to improve on, not in the way that Lindy's flaws are highlighted as something that he will eventually grow out of. Aside from not fitting into English society, there isn't really something that we as the reader see Stella is struggling with. And in the text, it's not really even painted as something good to strive for, fitting in, because the author really makes it a point to show how rude and stuffy the rest of the English characters are. Therefore, Stella's inability to adapt to her new surroundings is not a flaw either, and it just becomes a quirk in her personality. The text paints English polite society as not good, and it's exemplified by how terrible Lindy's family and social circle is. So the reader is practically forced to sympathize with Stella because everybody else is cartoonishly painted as some kind of rude evil monster. And the class commentary I was really hoping for is nowhere to be found in the actual story, so it was a huge disappointment for me in that regard. At this point, I wondered whether it was even necessary for the story to be set in this time and place, because I didn't really feel like it utilized anything from the setting. It's not set in a particular year. There's no like larger events happening in the background that people can latch on to as being affected by. Unlike Agatha Christie novels, where of course all of the stories are contained in personal relationships, you can tell that they are still being affected by things like the war or these larger shifts in society, and that's what makes the story come to life and more real. Whereas this one, it really feels paper thin and just like shallow in a sense. I hate to say it. Obviously, that's not a very nice thing to say, but this is my review, so that's how I feel about it. And the actual murder plot itself, I thought it was really boring. Like, I don't know, it just was like, oh, okay, someone dead. Oh, you found out who it was? Oh, that's great. In fact, I didn't actually like a lot from the book, aside from the budding romance between Stella and Lindy. It was enough to give me some hope for the next installment of the series, which is why I read the second book. So now I'll talk about Murder at Blackwater Bend, which is the second installment of the series. And I do have a lot more to say about this second book, so I will chop it up into sections, I guess. So first, I'll talk about the story and the mystery first. So now our protagonists, Stella and Lindy, are engaged to be married. The mystery for this book centers around the death of Lord Fairbrother, who is Lindy's ex-girlfriend's husband, who is rumored to have rigged the annual Best in Breed pony competition. And I don't remember Lindy's ex-girlfriend's name, even though she is the main antagonist and the killer. I completely forgotten her name. So anyway, the main suspect, the only suspect really, is a vagabond who lives in the woods named Harvey. And the only reason why Stella and Lindy actually bother or care about solving the mystery and clearing his name is because Harvey had cured Stella's pony after it was attacked by a snake. So I actually have so much to complain about this book. You'd think that because I have more to say about this, that maybe I have more to compliment, but I think I have more to complain about than anything else. First of all, I think the murder plot itself doesn't really concern Stella and Lindy all that much. Their involvement in it is quite contrived, and I get that maybe the author is trying to say, oh, look how good and kind Stella and Lindy are, clearing the name of this homeless person, and they care about poor people unlike their snobby counterparts. But there's no risk and there's no sense of danger for Stella and Lindy because they have no personal stake in this aside from the thin thread of care that Stella seems to have for Harvey. And again, I really dislike how Stella, who is claimed to be the most kind-hearted character in the novel, she only seems to want to clear Harvey's name because of the favor he did for her rather than the fact that he was a human being that deserved dignity and justice after death. So I thought, again, so much wasted potential. Again, it could have been a really interesting critique on how the wealthy don't value the lives of the poor, and another interesting critique on classism. But even our own heroine, the person that we are rooting for, only seems to be interested in what Harvey had done for her, not who he was as a person. And then as for the ending, the culprit is so obvious, and it was written in as if the author had already known that we as the reader have probably figured it out halfway through, rather than trying to like redirect our attention or our suspicions onto other people to make it more interesting. The author made the culprit, the killer, so insufferable throughout the book that you as a reader feel like you're manipulated into finishing the book so you can feel some vindication when the killer is finally revealed and prosecuted. And that feels scummy and I don't like it. And then moving on to the prose and writing of the book, the author, despite basing the most significant conflict in the story, not just this story but the previous one, between the differences between American and British polite society and the cultures of the wealthy elite, isn't actually that interested again in exploring those dynamics, which is like, why bother setting the characters and the stories in that place and not going all the way? I also felt like the way that British decorum was constantly looked down upon in the text, it really started to feel like it was just the author's own prejudice against British polite society projected into the story. I'm not necessarily here to defend British polite society, but it just weakens the writing, in my opinion. And also, the writing, it feels so repetitive. It felt like it was just more padding to make the book longer, or that I kind of felt insulted. Like, do you not think I would remember what happened 2 chapters ago that you feel like you have to keep reminding me? As for the characters, it's again frustrating to see that every girl except Stella is portrayed so demonically that there is no sympathy for anybody else. It's almost like you're forced to like Stella since she's literally the only person who doesn't suck. And it's starting to veer off into this weird internalized misogyny area because, again, all of the female characters in the book are not likable. Lady Philippa, the reporter, Lindy's mom. Oh, wait, that's her name. The killer's name is Lady Philippa. Lady Philippa, the reporter, Lindy's mom, even Lindy's sister, who does not even do anything, seem like they're purposefully made atrocious so that Stella appears better in comparison. In fact, Stella's only positive female relationship is with her Aunt Rachel, who has 6 lines in the entire novel. It was just hard to ignore this thing that I kept noticing, that every girl seems to have it out for Stella. It just felt like a very #not like other girls moment for her. I do understand that this might be the author's way of highlighting Stella's isolation and lack of friends to make her romance with Lindy all the more significant, because he is the only one who seems to understand her, who loves her, who wants to spend time with her. But again, it just feels like a cheap shortcut to establishing the connections with each character to each other. Like, of course, Lindy has fallen in love with Stella because she's the only girl who doesn't suck. And of course, Stella would fall for Lindy because he's the only one who actually wants to spend time with her. Stella is constantly built to be sympathetic because she's belittled so ceaselessly by everybody else. But at some point, you just want to grab her shoulders and start shaking her to stand up for herself, because again, she's supposed to be ahead of her time, but that's not what we're seeing in the text itself. We're just being told that she's a certain way, but she acts in a completely different way. And then finally, the romance, which I thought was the most entertaining part of the book. The chemistry is definitely more palpable in this one, I guess because the first book kind of had to establish their personalities and their dynamics first, in the same way that a pilot episode to a TV show might have to do. So I think from here onwards, the romance will be turned up to 11, because that's kind of what the readers are asking for when they read a series like this. And I do like the internal monologue of Lindy. I think his is, again, he's a little bit more interesting than Stella. He is so in love with her that every other paragraph, it seems like he's just I love Stella so much. She's so beautiful, etc., etc., etc. And of course, that could be a trope in the romance genre. The way that you built the male protagonist to be devoted to the female protagonist is something that the reader is hooked by. And I also really like how, because the main antagonist is Lindy's ex-girlfriend, it's like we get a more glimpse into his life before Stella arrived, and I thought that was a really interesting level of character depth that we saw from him, which I wish I could stay for Stella because again, we don't really know much about her and she's kind of just there. I don't know. That's all I really had to say about these 2 books. I might try the 3rd book, giving this series one last shot, but I am also willing to drop the entire series because at this point it feels like it's not fair to complain about the book more than I compliment it, when I could very well just not engage with it any further. I could also just be devoting my time to something that I will like instead of reading more of this series. The next series I attempted to try is the Jane Wonderly series by Erica Ruth Neubauer. The first book is Murder at Mena House. This story is about a young woman named Jane Wonderly, who is a widower and is a guest at the Mena House Hotel with her Aunt Mildred in Cairo as they are on vacation. A death occurs in the hotel that implicates Jane's involvement, so she is forced to prove her innocence when the police are obviously against her. So I didn't actually read the synopsis for this book before jumping straight into listening to the audiobook. And if I had, I might have been more prepared for the Orientalism to jump out. The story is set in Cairo after World War II, so I couldn't discern whether the Orientalist perspective is meant to be an intentional character trait for Jane Wonderly as a woman of her time period, like that was something the author was trying to strive for, or if that was just the author's own perspective bleeding into the writing. I won't get into the specifics of Orientalism right now, but I will try to sum it up for the purposes of my review. Orientalism is a phrase that was made popular by an academic named Edward Said. It is a term that refers to a general patronizing Western attitude towards Middle Eastern, Asian, and Northern African society. In Edward Said's analysis, the West essentializes these societies as static and undeveloped, thereby fabricating a view of Oriental culture that can be studied, depicted, and reproduced in the service of imperial power. Implicit in this fabrication, writes Said, is the idea that Western society is developed, rational, flexible, and superior. This allows Western imagination to see Eastern cultures and people as both alluring and a threat to Western civilization. So when I refer to something as Orientalist, I'm simply referring to a mode of critiquing how we, as people who live in the West, exoticize these foreign places in ways that can be harmful in the long run, or at least weaken your writing. There were sections in the book where Jane, our protagonist, describes Cairo and all the people who are inhabitants of Cairo and Egypt, and I just can't help but feel that the author doesn't know much about the place that she set the story in. I felt like the prose was a bit lacking. I'm not saying you have to go to a place physically to be able to write about it, but that certainly doesn't hurt, right? Especially in the age of the internet, you can definitely look things up all over the world and research all these things. Therefore, I was a bit unimpressed with, I felt like, a very shallow description of the setting. And the construction of the mystery, I think, wasn't great either. The motive tacked onto our protagonist, Jane, to make her a suspect, I felt it was just too flimsy for me to swallow. I was largely unimpressed by the subplots, and the main mystery of Anna's death didn't feel really satisfactory to me, because in hindsight, it could have only really have been the dad to have killed her, since he was the only one that benefited from her death. Like, there were no real suspects. Trying to speak with some caution here. In chapter 10, there's a very sudden trauma dump section of Jane's abusive ex-husband who died in the war. And I felt like it came out of nowhere. The way that it came out of nowhere could be seen as a sign that the events of the death, the murder of Anna, were re-traumatizing Jane due to the stress and turmoil building around her as her life is put in the control of the police, which are another male authority figure. On paper, I felt like that was a really effective way of conveying how trauma comes back, but when executed in the book, I didn't care. And even at that point, I did not really relate to Jane as a character, and so this just made relating to her even less possible. And I'm not saying it's because I'm not a domestic abuse survivor, therefore I can't relate to another domestic abuse survivor. But I don't know, I just felt like the way it was written, it just felt surface level and shallow. And of course, I do want to emphasize that it's not fair for me to comment on how accurate the portrayal of domestic abuse trauma is, because I myself have not experienced it, and for all I know, the author herself may have had firsthand experience, in which case I do not want to come across as dismissing what very well be a very valid representation of a delicate topic. But when I read it, I was kind of just more confused about the entire book than I was engaged with the story of Jane and the rest of the plot. Moving on to the relationships that Jane has, I thought this was a very amusing comparison to the Stella and Lindy books, because one of my criticisms of the Stella and Lindy books is that Stella had no friends in her new life because every female character seemed to compete for the cattiest bitch award, whereas in the Jane Wonderly book, she has so many allies that it almost felt like she had too many people on her side to ever feel like her life is threatened. And of course, maybe that's something that the author's trying to say, like, oh, Jane had such a harsh life with her abusive husband and the fact that her Aunt Millie hates her. But like, we are set in this particular story, I thought it would have been more impactful if she experienced a more impactful level of isolation and stress. She has too much of a support system. And in fact, none of the friends that she has have distinct personalities either. So even if she did have a lot of friends, at least make them interesting and different from each other. And maybe they have different purposes. Maybe you have a friend who is very frivolous and she cares about clothes and she only thinks about shopping. So maybe Jane will go to her if she wants a distraction and they can go shopping and she doesn't have to think about like life or her circumstances and maybe she has another friend who is more practical and stern, and so whenever Jane is starting to feel she needs a grounding presence in her life, she would go to that friend. Instead, I feel like all the friends in her book, they're all the same person. It's like nice friend number 1, nice friend number 2, nice friend number 3. Again, you missed a good opportunity to create more in-depth characters. On the other hand, Aunt Millie, I think, is annoying to me because it's not really explicitly explained why she doesn't like Jane and why she's such a bitch to her. And then, moving on to the relationship between Jane and Redverse, I hated that too. The most frustrating ending ever is how the author slathered this romance between them so thickly, only for Jane to discard him at the end. That was just really annoying. After pages and pages of chemistry and romance. And again, I understand that maybe this was a way for the reader to stay engaged with the series, because what's the fun in them getting together at the end when you can stretch it out for another 30 books? I don't know. Why did you build up so much chemistry and romance between the two of them? The point where them getting together was like the focus of the story, only to throw it away like at the end. No particular reason cited either. She was just like, oh, bye. It would have been better for her to be like, oh, I like you. We've been through so much through this ordeal, but I just need more time to myself. I would have appreciated that. I needed something like that. It wasn't the girl boss slay moment you thought it was. Felt like all of her daydreaming about him was for nothing. It might seem like I really hated this book, and you might be onto something, but I was willing to give the series another shot. Therefore, I decided to listen to the audiobook Murder at Wedgefield Manor, the second installment. So this book is set in Wedgefield Manor in England. In the first book, we did discover that Aunt Millie had an illegitimate child who was raised in England by her biological father and his wife. Aunt Millie and Jane are invited to stay at the husband and wife's estate, and Lillian, who is the illegitimate child, doesn't know that Aunt Millie is her real mother, and she's intending to keep it that way. I was hoping that in this book we might get some explanation as to why Aunt Millie is so hell-bent on getting Jane to remarry, or even an explanation as to why, despite her being so motivated to find Jane a husband, Aunt Millie doesn't really seem to like Jane all that much. I understand that the motivation to get Jane to remarry is enough to propel this character forward, but I just don't understand why that has to be her only motivation. Again, in the first book, Aunt Millie, I think, was just really frustrating because there's no depth. Like, okay, she has an illegitimate daughter that she's never spent time with, like, boohoo, I don't know, whatever. It seemed like she doesn't care about Jane. She doesn't like spending time with her, doesn't understand Jane. And so I was like, why does she keep inviting Jane around as a companion if she hates her so much? And I was thinking, okay, maybe Aunt Millie is resentful at Jane for possibly not mourning her nephew enough when he died. Because, sorry, I forgot to mention this, Aunt Millie is Jane's ex-husband who was abusive to her. However, that's how they're related. That's why she's Aunt Millie. That's how they are related. They're not blood related. I didn't understand why Aunt Millie would be so motivated to remarry Jane again, because I thought the reason why she was annoyed at Jane is because she wasn't honoring the memory of her nephew enough. But we as a reader don't actually know if Aunt Millie liked her nephew. And we also don't know whether Aunt Millie knew that he was abusive to Jane. Because the way that we know that he's abusive is through Jane's perspective. Therefore, if Jane doesn't know whether Aunt Millie knew that her nephew was abusive or not, then neither would we. But we as a reader don't know whether Aunt Millie knew that he was abusive, and doesn't know whether Jane knows that Aunt Millie knows that the nephew was abusive. Do you see why I'm so frustrated with this book? Like, what the hell? And then the straw that broke the camel's back for me was in chapter 2. Lillian and this guy named Simon, who is, I think, a servant in the estate, announced their engagement to the rest of the family. So Lillian's real father, the wife, Aunt Millie, and Jane find out at the same time. Aunt Millie is the only person who is acting the way she should be acting for a person living in that time period. So because when everybody finds out that Lillian and this guy who is below her class, when they find out that they're getting engaged, everyone's like, oh my God, congratulations. And Aunt Millie's like the only person who's like acting the way that a person of that time would react, which is like, no, you guys are not in the same level. And of course, I'm not advocating for class hierarchy, but it just completely breaks the immersion. Because how is everybody okay with them getting married, but Aunt Millie is apparently the only one who is like acting the right way, and everybody turns against Aunt Millie too, when no, you guys are the one who's acting weird. You're supposed to be like not enjoyed at their relationship too. Again, it's like the author forgot what time period she's writing in. And so I think at that point I was like, okay, I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. I was starting to lose my mind. So I stopped reading the book. Moving on to the last book in my review, I really wanted to read something that I knew I would like. So I went to listen to the audiobook of Murder in Mesopotamia by Agatha Christie. And I'm a big Agatha Christie fan. And I specifically chose this book because I had finished reading Murder at Mena House, and I wanted like a palate cleanser, I guess. And I kind of wanted to compare how a person writing for that time period would compare with a person who is looking back on the past. Obviously, Agatha Christie was writing in her time period, and I think that's why she's such a great hit. It's kind of timeless almost, but you still understand that it's written in a specific time period. Her writing style is just easier to be immersed in. And when I was reading, or listening rather, to Murder in Mesopotamia, it made me realize what it was that I thought was annoying about Murder at Mena House, is that they're both stories that are set in places where Orientalist perspectives can be easily adopted when you're thinking or reading about or writing about that place, even though they're set in different countries, with Murder at Mena House set in Cairo, Egypt, and Murder in Mesopotamia kind of set in the general Middle East area. Mesopotamia, I looked it up on Wikipedia, kind of covers Iran, Kuwait, Syria, and Turkey. It's set in an archaeological dig in that area. The difference is that Christie actually has been to archaeological digs, maybe not necessarily Mesopotamia, but she's been to one and has been immersed in that location. Therefore, she's able to bring to life this location for us, person recounting these events. Whereas Neubauer, as an author, can only be a contemporary writer looking back on the past, and she's projecting modern ideas to the past. And so obviously it's not really fair to compare them, because again, Christie is writing from that time period herself. Neubauer is having to go back in time. And you can tell how passionate Christie was about archaeological sites and the place that she's in because of the way she writes about them. She really breathes life into these places. I actually already knew how this story was going to end because I have watched all of the BBC Poirot episodes. I knew how it ended. I knew who the culprits and the suspects were. However, I still wanted to kind of reread this and see how different that episode is compared to the actual source material. It's actually quite different for a lot of reasons. Obviously, TV adaptations have to do a lot to adapt the story into a completely new medium. Some things can be lost, I guess, translation, so to speak. One of the things that got lost in the TV show episode is this amazing narrator through this character we just call her Nurse. I don't think she has a name in the book. People just call her Nurse, and even because she's a first person narrator, she doesn't necessarily call herself by her name. The narrator is this nurse who is employed by Mr. Leidner for his wife, Mrs. Leidner, who he suspects is struggling with her health while being on this archaeological dig, whether that's physical health or mental health. She has been employed by him to kind of be a companion and to look after her and just to have another set of hands to help around the archaeological dig. She is really an amazing narrator for a lot of reasons. The advantage being that she is a nurse who obviously has had a long life of past experiences and histories, and she uses those past experience to enrich her narrative. Various people that she meets remind her of people that she's encountered in the past, and thereby I feel like it adds depth to whenever she's trying to describe a person's personality or attitude. It also kind of adds a bit of a biased perspective on her that I think makes her more interesting and makes the narrative interesting. And I like the way that Christie uses this character who doesn't like archaeology at all. She's a nurse, she's practical, she's firm, and she knows her work, but she thinks archaeology is a bit dull. Christie uses that perspective to making the nurse a surrogate reader so that the people reading this book also think archaeology is dumb. Therefore, the more nurse learns about archaeology and the more she likes archaeology, the more the reader will understand and the more the reader will like archaeology too. So I just thought that was like a really clever way of handling her setting and imparting some knowledge about archaeology that not a lot of people would have known at the time, because Christie is one of the very few people who could afford to do it and have connections to be at these archaeological sites. And then, as I said, I already knew how the story was gonna go. It still was really chilling the way the solution was presented, especially when Dr. Leidner confesses to the murder with an air of acceptance and weariness in his voice and his manner. The nurse is a great narrator because of how she's able to breathe Louise Leidner, the wife, to life. Nurse and every other character in the book is infatuated with Louise Leidner in a really specific way. The way her impact is described on characters is so fascinating. The ghost of her lingers throughout the book, and even in death, she's still haunting people in a way. And I think that's why I'm not so fussed about the ending. A lot of reviewers were a bit frustrated with the improbable ending, but I think to me the highlight of the book was the weight of the story. Even after the audiobook finished, all I could do was sit in my room in silence and ruminate on everything that I just listened to. So it was very good. And in comparison to the BBC episode with David Suchet, I realized that the TV adaptation doesn't carry the same weight because of the nurse as the narrator. She's replaced by Captain Hastings as the Watson to Poirot's Sherlock, and Hastings kind of takes on the role of the narrator himself. Took away a lot of the depth that Nurse as narrator was able to impart. Because even though Nurse was technically an outsider to these cast of characters, she was still entangled in their lives in a way that offers her a stunningly rich idea of their lives and their connections with each person. And with that last book, that is the end of my murder mystery reading vlog. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I really rambled on, but I'll try to edit this so that I can concisely explain my feelings better. If you liked it, feel free to subscribe so you can catch my next book review. I've been listening to a lot of audiobooks lately, so there's definitely going to be a lot more released in the future. All of my social media links are down in the description if you want to follow me there too, alongside links to my Patreon and my Ko-fi pages if you want to support my work. I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye!